from lunch. My name is Emily Rosser, and I've been one of the co-organizers of this conference, and I just wanted to say thank you again for coming and for participating and being interested. It's been really great so far. Now we have reached the keynote portion of this conference, and I'm really excited about this part of the day. Before I make my introduction of our keynote speaker, I wanted to emphasize that we're hoping to keep working on some of these questions for longer than one day. And one of the things we're thinking about is forming some kind of research cluster, or we're not sure yet. But to keep talking and sharing ideas and thinking about some of these themes for longer term. So if you're interested in participating or in keeping informed about what kinds of activities we're up to, there's some sign-up sheets on the registration table just to keep in touch with us, and we'll keep you up to date. We might take a week off after this. Yeah, you can also get in touch with us at any time at the email address associated with this conference, which is on most of your materials. Okay, so I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Her name is Dr. Pascha Bueno-Hansen, and her talk is entitled Decolonizing Transitional Justice, a Feminist Analysis. Yes, that's still the title. Dr. Pascha Bueno-Hansen earned her doctoral degree from the University of California, Santa Cruz, in politics, feminist studies, and Latin American and Latino studies. At the University of Delaware, she's an assistant professor of women and gender studies, with affiliations to the political science and international relations department, as well as the Latin American and Iberian studies program. Her book, entitled Feminist and Human Rights Struggles in Peru, Decolonizing Transitional Justice, is forthcoming with the University of Illinois Press. Dr. Bueno-Hansen has published articles and book chapters on issues including sexual violence, feminicide, women of color feminisms, sexuality, race, transitional justice, and social movements. She places her research and teaching at the service of social justice. So we're thrilled to have a keynote speaker whose work speaks so directly to the themes at the heart of this event today. Across a range of topics, this is how we feel. The theoretical richness of Dr. Bueno-Hansen's scholarship is only enhanced by the keen sense of the urgent material issues at stake. As many in this room know, this type of synthesis is crucial, but it's also often difficult to negotiate in transnational discussions of violence, feminisms, colonialisms, and transitional justice. So we're excited and honored that Dr. Bueno-Hansen has agreed to address us today. And we're also very anxious to get our hands on the new book when it comes out. So this is a little taste. The address will be followed by a question and answer session. I don't want to take up any more time. If you could please join me in welcoming Dr. Pascha Bueno-Hansen.
Good afternoon. I'm so happy to be here, and I want to give thanks to Emily and to Jessica for their incredible vision in organizing this conference, and all of the sponsoring institutions and groups here at York University who've made this conference possible. The title of my talk will be Decolonizing Transitional Justice, a Feminist Analysis, and as you know, this presentation is based on my forthcoming book. I would like to begin my remarks by dwelling for a moment on the emotional endurance required to work through these issues related to armed conflict and its aftermath in the long term, and what I have come to recognize as a need for healing and spiritual renewal. Yet it is difficult to acknowledge that need personally, given the incredible traumas and pain that those who actually lived through the conflicts and have died in the conflicts, what those populations sustain. And in my case, I have spent a decade or so thinking deeply about the Peruvian internal armed conflict. Sorry? An important source of renewal for me has been the artistic and cultural work of a Peruvian popular theater group group called El Grupo Cultural Yuyachkani. And in this image that I offer you, it's an image of a one-woman performance entitled Rosa Cuchillo, and she is an apparition, and seemingly so appropriate for Halloween, of a woman who, even after death, searches for her missing son. Her character is based on many testimonies and stories gathered in the aftermath of the conflict, during the conflict, and so forth. And this is typically performed in markets, central plazas, and atriums of churches. This piece depicts Rosa Cuchillo's desperate search, and also her intimate process of healing through Andean ritual practices that include song, dance, and water infused with flower petals. Rosa Cuchillo is a visual metaphor of healing and renewal, while also emphasizing the multiple ways of expressing or speaking of the unspeakable. So many violences that we talked about today so far. My most current work looks at the mutually influential relationship between El Grupo Cultural Yuyachkani and both state and civil society transitional justice initiatives in Peru, and that is for another conversation. So this is the place from which I start engaging the decolonial feminist practice of holistically locating myself and ourselves on multiple registers. Let's move to transitional justice. Interestingly, we have the International Journal of Transitional Justice special issue coming out next year entitled Transitional Justice, Does It Have a Future? And the questions, I think, are quite timely given this conference, or this conference is quite timely given this reflection. Is transitional justice the appropriate vehicle for achieving its purported goals? If it does not always lead to positive outcomes, why? Are there conceptual problems and theoretical deficiencies in how we make sense of justice and transitions that account for these failures? Or is it the translation of transitional justice norms into practice that is wanting? And when I saw this, I thought it would be a very appropriate sort of glimpse of the field to place our conference in its context. It's been more than a quarter of a century since transitional justice has developed on the global stage, and it seems that the less effective transitional justice mechanisms seem to be in their efforts to deliver democracy and peace, the more that we demand from them. So transitional justice has been taken to task and continues to be taken to task on many fronts, and this moment in the theory and practice of transitional justice begs several questions in my mind. And those questions that sort of haunt me are, what's next? How do we anticipate what is to come? How do we catch glimpses of our many possible futures while tending to the legacies of violence that continue to haunt us? Rather than posing these questions as some sort of predictive exercise in the evolution of a field, I rather bring attention to the workings of these logics that embrace some populations in the bounds of a life-affirming nexus, while others are marked as unworthy, whose humanity goes unrecognized, lives extinguished with no regard. In other words, I refer to the workings of structural violence, and we are in desperate need of calling forth our transformational potential grounded in a collective envisioning process. Let us move to locating ourselves on our fragile earth to which we belong. And I am here as a visitor from your bellicose neighbor to the south. And in being from the south, I come here and while also acknowledging the lands, those who have relationships with the lands where I am located in the U.S., which are the Lenape, I also would like to acknowledge those groups with relationships to the land here where York University is founded. The Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Anishinaabe, and the ongoing patterns of violence and erasure, as well as the ongoing struggles for survival. And I offer you this beautiful and striking image moving to another part of Canada, and this image refers to the struggle taking place to end the murder and disappearance of Aboriginal women an issue that Kim Stanton educated us on in the last panel. And specifically, this image is related to a vigil that was held in Montreal just last month. And I offered this image in a way to also highlight the intergenerational aspect of the struggles. This is an invitation to reflect upon how, why, and from what position do we engage and intervene in transitional justice, encouraging an awareness of our intergenerational connections. And I'd like to keep in mind intergenerational perspectives as we ask why structural violence falls outside of our sort of dominant framings of transitional justice. And as a little reminder, when we think of structural violence, I immediately think of Galtung, and this is, where this term originates out of 1969, and some little pieces that I felt were a nice little reminder, thinking about the relation to social injustice, inequality in the distribution of power and resources, and that it's very naturalized and silent. Now, when we think about transitional justice and its genealogy, it comes out of human rights, comparative political science, and law without so much emphasis on history. Paige Arthur asks, why transitions? Why not the beginning of a long, open-ended process of establishing the social preconditions for democratic institutions? In other words, the structural preconditions for peace. And that might include a shift in socioeconomic structures, behavioral habits, and structural conditions that would actually allow for a thriving public sphere. Transitional justice must be contextualized in the shift towards a technocratic, sectoral, and policy-oriented approach that focuses on political elites and engineering and pacts. Short-term and political and institutional in nature, many have questions its unspoken sort of commitment or complicity with economic liberalization and market economy. So my intervention today is located at the very edges, if not falling off the screen sometimes, of transitional justice conceptual parameters. And with that, and I actually have to say, this is the first time that I can speak about these things in a space where I don't feel absolutely marginalized. So I want to just really express how much I appreciate this space. And with the aim of finding ways to expand the discussion, of course, of transitions and of the scope of harms that can be understood and made visible within the framework of international human rights law. Again, addressing what we understand to be structural violence. Yet the framing questions for this conference that Emily and Jessica put together press us to question, how can we intervene in the field beyond an intellectual exercise? How can we create a productive dialogue? And how can we contribute to social change? In echoing Kamari Clark's insights, I suggest that we dwell in the productive tension between using all available tools to make change, all of them, while at the same time pressing and probing those parameters of these fields that we're in and pushing them to think beyond. So both at once, and that creates, in doing that, it creates a productive tension. Sometimes we can think of it as like a divide that cannot be reconciled, and I much strongly prefer to think of the productive tension. So from my research, I have found great promise in community-based, interdisciplinary, and intercultural work. And the group that I worked with in Peru, DEMUS, it's known as DEMUS, or in English, the Study and Defense of Women's Rights. This is just the first line of their mission statement to give you sort of a sense of this explicitly feminist Peruvian NGO. I did fieldwork with them in 2006 and 2007, and the synopsis, the core of my comments, which I'll get to, is a synopsis of their community-based interdisciplinary and intercultural work, the kinds of challenges that they faced, how they dealt with them, and the feminist decolonial interventions it offers to transitional justice. And most importantly, the work sheds light on Andean-based conceptual frameworks that actually speak back to transitional justice logics and begin to help us answer the questions that I posed. What's next? How do we anticipate what's to come? How do we we grasp little glimpses of our possible futures while also attending to the legacies of violence? So before I can delve deeply into the nitty-gritty, I must give you some context. So we're moving to the southern part of this Americas, and you see here a world locator for Peru on the Pacific coast of South America. So I'm going to locate for you the Peruvian armed conflict, the transitional justice process. And here is an image of Peru, and it's again on the Pacific coast and neighbors of Ecuador, Colombia, Brazil, Bolivia, and Chile. So in Peru, Peru experienced an internal armed conflict between 1980 and 2000, and it started when Sendero Luminoso, or the Shining Path, rejected political formal incorporation into the elections in 1980. They rejected them, and they burned ballot boxes in a rural community in the Andes, which is, this is topographical, so you should be able to note that the Andes run all the way through Peru, and took up arms. The group Sendero Luminoso took up arms to mount a Maoist revolution. Other actors that you may have heard of are the Tupac Amaru revolutionary movement and of course the armed forces. And while the conflict was initiated in Ayacucho, during the 1980s it expanded out to the broader swath of the central Andes and into the Amazonian region, which is after the Andes, the watershed breaks into all the way, the Amazon all the way to the east coast of Brazil. So what happened with this conflict is that the civilians got caught in the crossfire, and people lost, of course, lives, livestock, homes, agricultural lands, and so forth. And it threw many people into the desperation of being displaced and searching for their disappeared loved ones, as Rosa Cuchillo's apparition demonstrates or elucidates. The Peruvian nation-state in crisis due to this armed conflict, and also, I'm not going to go into detail about Alberto Fujimori's authoritarian rule, which came to an end also in the late 90s. So the Peruvian nation-state was in incredible disarray, highly destabilized, no legitimacy domestically or in the international stage, and came to embrace a transitional justice mechanism of a commission to bolster itself. The commission was mandated to investigate the causes and consequences of the conflict, and that happened 2001 to 2003. So according to the final report, the majority of the almost 70,000 victims who lost their lives were Andean Quechua speaking or from Amazonian groups, ethno-linguistic groups, including the Amhuesha, the Ashanika, and the Nomatsiwenga. 75% of those killed were indigenous groups. And the conclusions noted in a very powerful way that this generalized disregard for the tragedy over those decades, there was not very much sort of awareness overall in Peru, that disregard had to do with the roots of the Peruvian Republic, that it was that disregard is rooted in the nation state. And ethnic discrimination in Peru has roots in the colonial encounter with Spain, sorry. And of course you are familiar with the way in which colonizers understand themselves as civilized in contrast to those barbaric natives. And that became the narrative that Peru adapted to understanding what would be the definition of modern. And so in other words, those who most closely resembled light-skinned, heteronormative males who are literate and able-bodied would have more access to citizenship. And this is not a new story to anybody, but it's important to highlight how this plays out in Peru. And the resulting ethnicized underclass and the contemporary violence perpetrated against them echoes patterns of domination that shift in shape given the actors and the context. Now, this reflection also is important for understanding gender-based violence, as I'll get to right now. The Truth and Reconciliation report also noted that victims of sexual violence occupy the lowest ranks of the social hierarchy in Peru, and 75% were Quechua-speaking peasant women, 83% rural areas, majority with primary education or less, and between the ages of 10 and 29. Therefore, what becomes very clear is that success of state and civil society to address gender-based violence must think beyond just gender. It must pay attention to linguistic factors, ethnic factors, class, morality, and so forth, in the way that they take form in Peru. And one small example is that the people in the Andes don't necessarily choose to self-identify as indigenous. So this is so people understand them, that mark themselves in other ways that might have to do with class or might have to do with culture or language. So this is just one little piece. Like, I'm not going to say that, I'm not going to necessarily use indigenous as a term. I'll be using Quechua-speaking peasant to honor that self-identification process. Also, given the centralized spatialization of Peru, morality is an important factor. Lima, which is right in the middle on the coast, is associated, it was actually the viceroyal capital of the Spanish colony, and it is where there's the concentration of the administrative decision-making power and so forth. And then the Andes and the Amazon are considered to be, needing to progress and develop and all of those types of narratives. Now, if we think about it spatially, an interesting observation by a feminist geographer named Maureen Hayes Mitchell points out how during an internal armed conflict you have a confluence going on between geographic isolation and social exclusion and marginalization and selectivity and intensity of violence. So these things compound each other. And understanding these sets the backdrop for transitional justice in the case of Peru. Of course, to understand the roots of this violence, I turn towards decolonial feminisms to study these ways that the colonial relations persist to the current day. And as Marta Mercado already started to note, some notable decolonial feminists, Maria Lugones, Rosalinda Fregoso, Ofelia Schutt, Claudia Lima Costa, are all people that have influenced me and all call for the full recognition of people beyond these complex interaction of economic, racial, and gendered systems. How can we work through those intricacies of oppression to recognize people as whole beings? My work contributes to this project of decolonizing our epistemologies and practices of transitional justice. And again, Marta Mercado mentioned Aníbal Quijano, and another decolonial thinker is Walter Mignolo, and really highlighting how the flip side of what we understand as coloniality is modernity, that these two are not separable. And therefore, this modernity coloniality, we have to keep it in mind as we think about these violences and what is seen, what harms are registered and which are not. In my feminist decolonial study, I emphasize community-based conceptual frameworks for interpreting what happened. And now I get back to Demos. So in 2004, this group, Demos, began a project to follow up on the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation findings regarding sexual violence. And now the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation, in addition to its sort of reconciliatory goals, also prepared 48 legal cases 47 legal cases that they would pass to the judicial system in Peru once they completed their investigation. 2 of those cases were of sexual violence, and 1 of them focused on the way in which sexual violence took place in and around military bases in rural areas. So Demos chose to follow up and be sure that that 1 case that highlighted how sexual violence had been systematically perpetrated in rural areas around military bases, Demos took it up and wanted to be sure that it went through all of the ins and outs of the judicial process in Peru. Now, I want to locate you a little further. That case was located in Huancavelica, and that's that darkened area is the department of Huancavelica, obviously in the Andes, one of the poorest departments in the nation state of Peru, and one of the hardest hit by the conflict. The reasoning behind the armed forces in terms of where they would place a military base, they wanted clearly to have geostrategic potential to really help them control the area, and also in communities that were